she carried the happiest secret of her life into the place where her heart would break. The tiny silver baby bracelets rested safely inside Arya Evermoon's cloak. She had traced their delicate engravings so many times that afternoon she could have done it with her eyes closed. They were small enough to fit in the palm of her hand, each one etched with tiny crescent moons and stars. The royal physician had smiled only hours earlier. "Congratulations, my Luna. The moon goddess has blessed you." Arya had floated through the palace ever since. Tomorrow marked 5 years since she and Alpha King Damian Blackwood had completed their sacred mating ceremony. She had planned everything carefully. A quiet breakfast before the court awakened, his favorite honey cakes prepared by the palace kitchen, and then the bracelets. She wanted to watch his face when he realized he was going to become a father, a family, the future they had dreamed about during countless late-night walks through the palace gardens. As she crossed the eastern courtyard, one of the royal guards bowed respectfully. "Your Majesty, have you seen the Alpha King?" she asked. The guard nodded. "He rode toward the old moon temple about half an hour ago." Arya smiled. Perfect. The abandoned temple had always been Damian's favorite place whenever he needed to think. Long before he became Alpha, he used to escape there whenever the weight of responsibility became too heavy. She pulled her cloak tighter against the evening breeze and followed the quiet forest path leading beyond the capital. The old temple stood exactly as she remembered it. Moonlight spilled through the broken roof, painting silver patterns across the ancient stone floor. She stepped inside, then stopped breathing. Only a few feet away stood Damian. His arms were wrapped around another woman, Lady Selene Ashcroft, his former mate. Selene's shoulders trembled as she buried her face against Damian's chest. "I don't know how to let go," she whispered, her voice breaking beneath quiet sobs. Damian gently rested a hand against her back. "You'll never have to face this alone." Time stopped. Arya's fingers loosened. The tiny silver bracelets slipped from her hand. They struck the stone floor with a soft, metallic chime before rolling across the temple. One disappeared beneath an old wooden pew. The other spun in a slow circle before coming to rest near Damian's boots. He turned instantly. "Arya!" His eyes widened in shock. Selene stepped back just as quickly, confusion replacing grief. But Arya wasn't looking at either of them anymore. She was looking at the space between them, the space where everything she believed about tomorrow quietly disappeared. A strange calm settled over her, not because she wasn't hurting, because pain, that deep, left no room for panic. She managed a small smile, the kind people wear when they know they are about to cry, but refuse to do it in front of strangers. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "Arya, wait." Damian reached toward her. She instinctively stepped backward, not out of anger, out of instinct, because broken things often moved away before they shattered completely. She turned and walked toward the temple doors. The cool night air met her trembling breath. Behind her, Damian called her name again. She never stopped. She couldn't. If she looked back, she feared she might still believe whatever explanation came next. And in that moment, believing hurt far more than leaving. Inside the temple, neither Damian nor Selene noticed the tiny silver bracelets lying forgotten upon the ancient stone floor. Neither of them knew they had just watched the future slip quietly out the door. By the time Damian finally understood what Arya had left behind, the woman carrying his greatest joy was already walking toward the darkest night of her life. Arya did not run. She walked, one quiet step after another, through the sleeping palace, as though moving too quickly might force her to admit that everything she had believed only an hour ago no longer existed. The moon hung low above the towers. Its pale light followed her through the empty corridors that had once felt like home. When she entered the Luna wing, she closed the door gently behind her. The silence was unbearable. Only that morning she had stood before the mirror, imagining how Damien would smile when he saw the tiny silver bracelets. She had practiced telling him, "We're going to be parents." Now the words felt like they belonged to another woman, a woman who still believed tomorrow would arrive the way she had planned. Arya crossed to the wardrobe. Rows of elegant gowns shimmered beneath candlelight. Each one had been commissioned after she became Luna. She left every dress exactly where it hung. The jeweled crown remained inside its velvet case. The ceremonial cloak, embroidered with the blackwood crest, stayed folded across its stand. She slipped her wedding ring from her finger. For a long moment, she simply stared at it, resting in her palm. Then she placed it beside the crown, not because she no longer loved Damien, because love could not survive where trust had disappeared. She packed only what had belonged to her before the palace: a worn woolen shawl her mother had woven by hand, a weathered diary filled with healing recipes and pressed flowers, a small pouch of medicinal herbs she never traveled without. Nothing more. Her life fit inside one modest satchel. She sat at the writing desk where Damien often left her little notes before early council meetings. Tonight, only one sheet of blank parchment waited. She dipped the quill into ink. The words came more easily than she expected. "You don't have to choose anymore." She paused, her tears finally falling onto the page. "I've already made the decision for both of us." She stared at the sentence for several heartbeats before continuing. "I hope one day you'll find the happiness you couldn't find beside me. Take care of the kingdom. I'll learn how to take care of myself." She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the center of Damien's desk. No accusations, no questions, only goodbye. Before leaving, Arya walked through the nursery that had been prepared months earlier. Though no one else knew why, she had secretly begun collecting tiny blankets and wooden toys whenever she visited village markets. Her fingers brushed over the empty cradle. "I'm sorry," she whispered, resting a trembling hand against her stomach. "I thought you'd have two parents who loved you every day." She wrapped her cloak around herself and slipped quietly through the servants' entrance just before dawn. The guards greeted her with respectful bows. None of them imagined their queen was leaving forever. An hour later, Damien burst into the Luna wing. "Arya!" His voice echoed through the empty rooms. He found the untouched gowns, the abandoned wedding ring, the folded letter. Then, resting beside it, lay the shattered silver baby bracelets he had hurriedly gathered from the Moon Temple floor after she disappeared into the night. His heart stopped. A frantic knock sounded at the chamber door. The royal physician entered, breathing hard. "Your Majesty, I've been searching everywhere for the Luna." Damien looked up slowly. "Why?" The physician hesitated, then spoke the words that shattered whatever hope remained. "She was carrying your child." The room fell into a silence so complete that even the candle beside Arya's farewell letter seemed afraid to flicker. Outside the palace gates, every road leading away from the kingdom had already grown cold. Damien didn't remember leaving the Luna wing. One moment, he was staring at the shattered silver baby bracelets in his trembling hands. The next, he was already on horseback, racing through the palace gates. Only one destination mattered: the old Moon Temple. If there was even the smallest chance, Arya had misunderstood what she had seen. He needed the truth now. Selene was still there. She sat alone on the temple steps, wrapped in a dark cloak, her eyes swollen from a night of grief. When she heard approaching hooves, she stood. Relief crossed her face. Damien. Instead of greeting her, he asked only one question. What happened here? She frowned. What do you mean? You were crying. I was holding you. Arya saw us. The color drained from Celine's face. Arya. Damien nodded once. She left. She's gone. For several heartbeats, Celine simply stared at him. Then she covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Oh, no. Tears filled her eyes again. My husband died yesterday. Her voice broke beneath the weight of the words. He collapsed during the northern border inspection. I buried him this morning. Damien stood perfectly still. She looked around the ancient temple. This place is where he proposed to me. I came because I couldn't bear walking into our home without him. She wiped another tear from her cheek. I didn't know who else to call. You were my oldest friend. You arrived. You let me cry. That was all. The world seemed to tilt beneath Damien's feet. No secret affair, no lingering love, no betrayal. Only a grieving widow saying goodbye to the man she had loved. He remembered Arya standing in the doorway, the way she had smiled. Not with anger, with surrender. She hadn't waited to hear another sentence. She hadn't known there was another story. Celine's eyes widened. Where is she? Damien lowered his head. I don't know. When did she leave? Last night. She closed her eyes. Oh, Damien. Without another word, he turned and mounted his horse. By the time he reached the palace, every order left his mouth before anyone could ask questions. Close every border. Send riders to every neighboring village. Search every inn, every forest trail, every harbor. Captain Aldrin didn't hesitate. Immediately, Your Majesty. Before noon, hundreds of royal scouts had spread across the kingdom. Damien searched, too. He rode until his horse nearly collapsed beneath him. Every traveler was questioned, every healer's cottage visited, every mountain pass explored. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Nothing. One rainy evening, Captain Aldrin entered the war room carrying a small leather journal filled with scouting reports. His face held the exhausted look of a man who had delivered too much disappointment. We found one witness. Damien stood immediately. Where? A shepherd near the northern frontier. He remembers helping a young woman. She was traveling alone. Damien's heart pounded. Describe her. Gray cloak, silver eyes, and... Aldrin hesitated. She appeared to be expecting a child. Damien gripped the edge of the table. Where did she go? The captain unfolded a weathered map. The shepherd had watched her cross the final bridge, leading beyond the kingdom, into the lands controlled by the Shadow Kingdom. After that, the trail simply ended. No village remembered her. No merchant recognized her. No border guard had seen where she disappeared. It was as though the snow itself had swallowed every footprint she left behind. Damien stared at the northern mountains, stretching across the map. Somewhere beyond them, the woman he loved had vanished, carrying their unborn child, and every passing sunrise carried her farther beyond his reach. The first snow fell the day Arya collapsed. For weeks, she had traveled north, with little more than determination, keeping her on her feet. She traded healing herbs for bread whenever she could, treated sick children in villages that welcomed strangers, and slept wherever the cold wind allowed. She never stayed long. Every time someone asked where she came from, she simply smiled and changed the subject. The farther she traveled, the quieter the memories became, but they never truly disappeared. Some nights she still woke reaching toward the empty space beside her. Then she remembered. There was no one there. The mountain road leading into the Shadow Kingdom was nearly buried beneath fresh snow. When her strength finally gave out, she placed one trembling hand against the child, growing safely beneath her heart. "I'm trying," she whispered. "I'm trying to keep us both safe." The words disappeared into the wind. Her vision blurred. The trees swayed. Then everything faded into darkness. Warmth. That was the first thing she noticed. Not pain, not fear. Warmth. A fire crackled softly somewhere nearby. The scent of pine wood and fresh herbs filled the room. When Arya slowly opened her eyes, she found herself lying beneath thick wool blankets inside a quiet stone chamber. Snow drifted gently beyond the tall windows. She tried to sit up. The door opened before she could. A tall man entered carrying a steaming cup. Dark hair, calm gray eyes, a simple black coat without unnecessary ornaments. He didn't wear a crown. He didn't need one. Everything about him carried quiet authority. "You should rest," he said. "The fever only broke this morning." Arya instinctively reached for her satchel. It rested untouched beside the bed. Nothing had been taken. Nothing searched. The stranger noticed her glance. "Your belongings are exactly where we found them." She relaxed slightly. "Where am I?" "The Shadow Kingdom." The answer should have frightened her. Instead, she felt too exhausted to be afraid. "I found you unconscious near the northern pass," he continued. "Our patrol brought you here before the storm buried the road." Only then did she realize who stood before her. King Lucian Nokthar, the ruler neighboring kingdoms, described as cold, ruthless, and impossible to trust. He quietly placed the cup on the table within her reach. "Drink. It will help." She hesitated only a moment before accepting it. The tea was warm with honey and mountain herbs, exactly the kind she would have prepared herself. Lucian waited until she finished half the cup. Then he asked the only question he would ever ask about her past. "Who hurt you?" Arya stared into the steam rising from the cup. The answer felt impossibly heavy. Where could she even begin? The temple, the bracelets, the letter, the endless road. At last, she whispered, "I'm too tired to tell the story." Lucian held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "Very well." No more questions followed. No demands. No curiosity disguised as kindness. He simply adjusted another log onto the fire. "If there comes a day you wish to tell it," he looked toward the door, "I'll listen. And if that day never comes, that will be your choice too." He left the room as quietly as he had entered. Arya watched the door close behind him. For the first time since leaving the Alpha Kingdom, someone had offered her safety, without asking her to relive the reason she needed it. Months later, as winter gave way to spring, the cries of a newborn echoed through the castle halls. Outside the chamber, King Lucian remained seated on a wooden bench throughout the entire night. He never entered. He never interrupted. He simply stayed, making certain that if Arya opened the door, someone would already be there. The little girl was born just before sunrise. Arya named her Lyra, because on the darkest nights of her journey north, she had looked toward the stars and whispered promises to the child she hadn't yet met. "As long as I can still see the sky, I'll find a way to keep us safe." Lyra's tiny fingers wrapped around Arya's thumb with surprising strength. In that moment, the loneliness that had followed her across kingdoms no longer felt quite as endless. King Lucian kept the promise he had made without ever speaking it aloud. He never asked who Lyra's father was. He never searched through Arya's past. He never tried to become something the child already had. Instead, he simply became someone she could depend on. When Lyra took her first steps, Lucian happened to be walking through the castle gardens. She stumbled toward him with an unsteady laugh before falling into the soft grass. Rather than lifting her immediately, he knelt beside her. "You can do it. I'll wait." She pushed herself upright with determined little hands, then proudly waddled the remaining steps into his waiting arms. He applauded, as though she had conquered an entire kingdom. Arya watched from the palace balcony. For the first time in years, her heart hurt for a beautiful reason. Not because something had been taken from her, because someone was quietly giving without expecting anything back. Life settled into a gentle rhythm. Arya reopened the abandoned infirmary inside the castle walls. Soon, villagers began arriving from every corner of the Shadow Kingdom. A shepherd whose son suffered from a stubborn fever, an elderly widow who could no longer see well enough to sew, children injured while helping their families in the fields. No one was turned away. When medicines ran short, Lucian quietly ordered new supplies without making speeches about generosity. When the waiting room became too small, he expanded the building before Arya even asked. One evening, she discovered architects studying maps spread across the council table. "What are these?" Lucian looked up. "Plans for a school." She blinked. "A school? You mentioned once that girls in remote villages rarely learn to read. I dislike wasting potential." Months later, the first school opened. Then another, and another. The hospitals followed. Not grand monuments built to glorify the crown. Simple, places where ordinary people could receive care, regardless of what they could afford. The Shadow Kingdom slowly changed. Travelers no longer spoke first about its feared warriors. They spoke about its healers, its schools, its kindness. The people noticed who had inspired those changes. Everywhere Arya walked, she was greeted not with formal bows, but with genuine affection. Children ran to hug her. Mothers thanked her through grateful tears. Old men tipped their hats as she passed. One spring afternoon, the kingdom gathered in the castle courtyard. Village leaders stood shoulder to shoulder with teachers, healers, farmers, and craftsmen. An elderly woman stepped forward, carrying a simple silver circlet. "You've already been our queen for years," she said softly. "We're only asking you to accept the title now." Arya looked across the crowd. These people had welcomed a frightened stranger without demanding her history. They had loved her before they knew her story. She glanced toward Lucian. He didn't nod. He didn't persuade. He simply waited for her answer, just as he always had. Arya smiled through quiet tears. "I accept," not because she needed another crown, but because, somewhere along the way, these people had become home long before they ever asked her to rule beside them. 7 years passed. The kingdoms changed. Old rivalries faded beneath new threats, and the greatest danger no longer came from armies. It came from disease. A strange plague swept across the continent without warning. Healthy wolves collapsed within days. Villages closed their gates. Markets stood empty. Even royal physicians admitted they had never seen an illness spread so quickly. Only one kingdom possessed an effective treatment: the Shadow Kingdom. Its hospitals had spent years studying rare mountain herbs under Queen Arya's guidance. While neighboring lands struggled, shadow healers slowed the sickness village by village. The Alpha Kingdom had no choice. For the first time in decades, Alpha King Damian Blackwood rode through the gates of the kingdom he had once called his greatest enemy. Not as a conqueror, as a king asking for help. The great throne room doors opened. Damian stepped inside. King Lucian sat upon the dark stone throne, calm as ever. Beside him stood Queen Arya. For a moment, Damian forgot how to breathe. 7 years had changed her. She carried herself with a quiet confidence he had never truly appreciated before. The sadness that once lingered behind her smile had been replaced by a steady peace. She looked happy, not because life had been easy, because she had rebuilt it. Before either of them could speak, laughter echoed through the hall. A little girl raced between the towering columns, chasing a wooden wolf carved from oak. "Slow down," Arya called gently. The child giggled and ran straight toward the throne. She couldn't have been older than 7. Dark curls bounced around her shoulders. Silver-gray eyes sparkled beneath the afternoon light. Then she looked up at Damien. His heart stopped. Those eyes, they were Arya's, but the shape of her smile, the stubborn lift of her chin, even the faint scent of the wolf sleeping within her, they were his. The room blurred around him. She was his daughter, the child he had never held, the child whose tiny silver bracelets had remained tucked inside his desk for 7 long years. Lyra tilted her head curiously. "Mother," Arya rested a gentle hand on the little girl's shoulder. "This is Alpha King Damien." Lyra smiled politely. "It's nice to meet you, Your Majesty." She bowed with all the seriousness only children could manage before running off toward the palace gardens. Damien watched her disappear. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. The council meeting passed in a haze. Trade agreements, medical supplies, travel routes for healers. He heard every word. He remembered none of them. After the meeting ended, Lucian approached him quietly. "If you'll walk with me." They crossed the castle gardens in comfortable silence until they reached a stone bridge overlooking a narrow river. Lucian rested his hands on the railing. "I know whose daughter Lyra is." Damien looked at him in disbelief. "You knew?" "I've always known." The answer carried neither accusation nor pride, only simple truth. Damien swallowed hard. "Then why didn't you tell her?" Lucian smiled faintly. "Because love isn't claiming someone when they're at their weakest." He looked toward the gardens, where Lyra's laughter drifted through the trees. "It's making sure they never have to be afraid again." Damien lowered his eyes. In that quiet moment, he understood the difference between the man he had been and the man standing beside him. One had loved Arya with all his heart. The other had loved her in all the ways she had needed most. Before they turned back toward the castle, Lucian spoke once more. "It's time." Damien looked up. "She deserves to hear the truth." That evening, the palace gardens fell silent beneath the glow of the full moon. The council had retired. The healers continued preparing medicine through the night. Somewhere in the distance, Lyra's laughter drifted from the castle courtyard before fading into the peaceful quiet of bedtime. Lucian stood outside the garden pavilion. He didn't enter. He simply nodded once to Arya. "I'll be nearby." It was all he said. He trusted her to choose the conversation for herself. Arya walked slowly into the pavilion. Damien was already there. For a long moment, neither spoke. 7 years of unanswered questions stood silently between them. At last, Damien broke the silence. "I owe you the truth." Arya folded her hands before her. "I know." He took a slow breath. "The night at the Moon Temple. Selena's husband had died that morning." Arya lowered her eyes. "I know. She asked me to meet her because that temple was where he proposed to her. I know. I held her because she couldn't stop crying. I know." Every answer came quietly, without anger, without accusation. Damien stared at her. "You believe me." She finally looked into his eyes. "I do." His shoulders sagged with relief. For one brief moment, hope dared to return. Then Arya asked the question that had lived inside her heart for 7 long years. "If I had stayed that night," her voice never rose. It didn't need to. "Would you have told me everything before sunrise?" Damien opened his mouth. No words came. He remembered his plan, the secret estate, the hidden horses, the belief that one painful night would somehow fix itself in the morning. At last, he answered honestly, "I thought—" He swallowed hard. "I thought you would come back. I thought one night wouldn't matter." The faintest smile touched Arya's lips. It wasn't bitter, only tired. "I waited." Damien frowned. She looked toward the moonlit gardens beyond the pavilion. "I packed slowly. I kept hoping you'd knock on my door. I sat beside that letter for hours. I thought—" Her voice trembled for the first time. "Surely he'll come after me before I leave." She closed her eyes. When the sun began to rise, I realized I had been waiting alone. The words shattered something inside him. All those years, he had imagined she left immediately. She hadn't. She had stayed, waiting for him, waiting for one conversation, waiting for the explanation that never came. Damien covered his face with trembling hands. "I was trying to save the kingdom. I know. I thought there would be time. I know. I'm so sorry." Silence settled gently between them. Not hostile, simply honest. After several moments, Arya spoke again. "The tragedy was never Celine. It was never another woman." She looked at him with quiet sadness. "It was waiting. Waiting to explain. Waiting to apologize. Waiting until morning." Damien nodded slowly. Every word was true. A soft knock interrupted the silence. The pavilion door creaked open. Little Lyra stepped inside, carrying a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She blinked sleepily between the two adults. "Mother?" Arya smiled immediately. "I'm here." Lyra walked over and slipped her small hand into Arya's. Then she looked curiously at Damien. Children often sensed what adults tried to hide. Something in her silver-gray eyes softened. She smiled, not because the past had suddenly become simple, but because, somehow, the sadness in the room no longer felt frightening. It felt like something that had finally found the courage to speak. Lyra looked from her mother to Damien with open curiosity. She sensed the tears in Damien's eyes. She noticed the way Arya gently squeezed her hand. Children often understood emotions long before they understood their causes. "Mother," she asked, softly, "is everything all right?" Arya knelt until they were eye level. "It will be." Lyra nodded, satisfied by the answer only a child could accept without further questions. Just then, Lucian stepped quietly into the pavilion. He had waited outside long enough to know the conversation had reached its end. He didn't interrupt. He simply walked to Lyra and rested a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's past your bedtime, little star." Lyra smiled mischievously. "I know, but everyone keeps talking." Lucian chuckled. "They've waited 7 years. I suppose another 5 minutes won't hurt." His light-hearted tone eased the heaviness in the room. For the first time since Damien had entered the Shadow Kingdom, the silence no longer felt unbearable. Damien slowly knelt before Lyra. He didn't reach for her. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't claim a place he had never earned. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I know I haven't been part of your life." Lyra listened carefully. "I can't ask you to call me father. I can't ask you to love someone you don't know." He smiled sadly. "I only hope that one day you'll allow me the chance to know you." The little girl looked thoughtfully at Lucian, then at Arya. Finally, she returned her gaze to Damien. "You look lonely." The simple observation struck harder than any accusation. Damien laughed softly through tears. "Sometimes." Lyra stepped closer. She slipped her tiny hand into his. It fit so perfectly that his breath caught. "I think—" She smiled with the fearless honesty only children possessed. "I have room for 2 people who love me." Silence filled the pavilion. This time, It wasn't painful. Arya covered her mouth as tears slipped down her cheeks. Lucian looked away briefly, giving the moment the privacy it deserved. Damien gently closed his fingers around Lyra's little hand, not tightly, not possessively, only gratefully. The following morning, the rulers of both kingdoms gathered in the Great Hall. The original purpose had been to negotiate the distribution of plague medicine. Instead, something far greater happened. King Lucian stood first. The Shadow Kingdom will share every remedy, every healer, and every piece of medical knowledge we possess. No kingdom will be denied because of old rivalries. Damien rose beside him. The Alpha Kingdom will do the same. We'll open our roads, our granaries, our hospitals. The age of treating each other as enemies ends today. The royal advisors stared in stunned silence. Generations of hostility dissolved with a simple handshake. Not because either king had forgotten the past, because one little girl had reminded them that love multiplies when it is shared. Months later, the first day of peace was celebrated along the border between the two kingdoms. Children from both lands planted young olive and cedar trees together. No one cared which side of the old border they came from. As Arya watched them laughing beneath the spring sunshine, she realized something extraordinary. The misunderstanding that had once destroyed one family's future had unexpectedly become the reason two kingdoms finally learned how to heal together. Years passed, and the Day of Peace became more than a celebration. It became a tradition. Each spring, the border between the Alpha Kingdom and the Shadow Kingdom filled with music instead of marching soldiers. Merchants traded freely. Children raced through fields that had once been battle lines. Healers from both kingdoms worked side by side, treating strangers without asking where they had been born. At the center of every celebration stood Queen Arya, not because she demanded attention, because people wanted to hear the story that had changed two kingdoms forever. Young wolves often asked the same question. "Your Majesty, what ended the war?" They expected tales of great battles, brilliant strategies, powerful kings. Instead, Arya would smile gently and answer, "A conversation that came too late." The children always looked confused, so she would kneel beside them and continue. "The greatest mistakes aren't always acts of betrayal." She glanced toward the restored moon temple standing nearby. "Sometimes, they're the conversations we postpone until tomorrow." Inside that ancient temple, where heartbreak had once begun, sunlight now poured through newly restored windows. At its center rested a simple glass display. Within it lay a tiny pair of silver baby bracelets. The very bracelets Arya had carried the night she intended to tell Damien they were expecting a child. Beneath the display, an inscription had been carved into white marble. "Love rarely dies because of one terrible moment. It dies when truth waits until tomorrow." Visitors stood before the bracelets in silence. Some left holding their partner's hand a little tighter. Others walked away, determined never to let pride speak louder than honesty. King Lucian never asked Arya to forget her past. He understood that healing was not the same as erasing. He simply continued loving her the way he always had, with patience, respect, and quiet consistency. Damien never stopped honoring the family he had almost lost. He became a familiar visitor, never arriving unannounced, and never expecting more than Arya wished to give. Over time, Lyra came to know him not as the father who had been absent, but as the man who never missed another promise. She learned to ride beside Damien through the forests of the Alpha Kingdom. She learned diplomacy from Lucian in the halls of the Shadow Kingdom. From Arya, she learned the lesson that mattered most. Never let fear finish a conversation that love still deserves. When Lyra grew into a wise young woman, she became the first royal ambassador shared by both kingdoms. Where others saw borders, she saw neighbors. Where others remembered enemies, she remembered family. Looking at her daughter, Arya often realized that the greatest miracle of her life had not been surviving heartbreak. It had been refusing to let heartbreak decide the rest of her story. History remembered Alpha King Damian Blackwood as the ruler who learned that courage must come before reputation. It remembered King Lucian Nocthar as the rival who proved true strength begins with making people feel safe. But above all, it remembered Queen Arya Evermoon, not as the Luna who disappeared, not as the queen who chose another kingdom, but as the woman who transformed one night of misunderstanding into generations of peace. Because in the end, Damian's greatest enemy had never been the Shadow King. It had been the silence that lasted until sunrise.